What we're gonna do right here is go back, way back, back into time.
After the family moved into a brand new apartment building at 1520 Sedgwick, Kool Herc would return to the hotel to frequent the disco downstairs, the Plaza Tunnel. A friend of his from high school named Shaft spun records there, as well as a DJ named John Brown. In gay and black clubs at the time, DJs were pushing the emerging four-on-the-floor disco beat. But the Plaza Tunnel DJs had a rawer sound. John Brown was the first to play records like Give It Up or Turn It Loose and Sex Machine by James Brown, It's Just Begun by the Jimmy Castor Bunch, Get Into Something by the Isley Brothers, Moment of Truth by Earth, Wind, and Fire, Melting Pot by Booker T and the MGs, Listen to Me by Baby Huey, Scorpio by Dennis Coffey and the Detroit Guitar Band, I Know You Got Soul by Bobby Byrd, with an eclectic mix of soul, R&B, and rock records like Maggie by Redbone, I'm a Man by Chicago, Get Ready by Rare Earth. Get Ready was a favorite in the Bronx because it lasted over 21 minutes, which was long enough for the serious dancers to get into the beat. They loved to wait for the song's 2-minute drum solo to show their most spectacular moves. At the climax of a Plaza Tunnel night, when DJ John Brown put on Soul Power, black Spades would overrun the floor, hollering Spade Power. The firecracker energy being generated at the Plaza Tunnel gave Kool Herc the standard to aim. By the early 1970s, Herc was venturing beyond his local neighborhood to other Bronx jukes such as the Puzzle, the Shaft, the Rat Hole, and Soulsville, later known as the Hevelo, often in the accompaniment of African-American style writers such as Phase 2, Super Cool 223, Uncle Rich, E.L. Marco 174, and Sweet Duke 161. When asked how he got his start in hip-hop, he specifically points to dancing in these underground venues with fellow artists, all them guys, we used to like music, Herc explains. We used to dance. We liked to dance. After we start bombing places, little trains and stuff like that, we go hang out in the Puzzle or somewhere downtown, Nemo's, Nell Gwynn's, places like that. Just as they took the alphabet beyond its confines through stylized signatures, these Bronxites moved their bodies in unrestricted ways on dance floors, as well. Like other partygoers, they socialized and did the latest dances, but, when the percussive crescendos of funk songs came on, they performed their own steps and movement. One of the most well-known clubs that Herc and his friends would frequent was the Plaza Tunnel, PT, located in the basement of the Grand Concourse Plaza Hotel in the West Bronx. For much of the borough's history, this hotel housed prominent politicians, businessmen, and New York Yankee baseball players. However, given the demographic changes in the region during the 1960s, the hotel found it increasingly difficult to fill its halls with affluent guests. As a result, it began catering to the African American and Latino residents who were populating the borough. Herc's recollection of the club was that it was an underground venue, both figuratively and literally, with attendees, who were overwhelmingly African American, going downstairs into a large, dimly lit room with just one strobe light and the red glow of exit signs illuminating its halls. Crowds of up to 400-500 teenagers would pack this basement club and dance to the music of DJ John Brown, a high school classmate of Herc's who would fuse funk records such as It's Just Begun, 1970, by the Jimmy Castor Bunch, Get Into Something, 1970, by the Isley Brothers, and Moment of Truth, 1971, by Earth, Wind, and Fire with an eclectic mix of soul, R&B, and rock records like Get Ready, 1970, by Rare Earth, Maggie, 1970, by Redbone, and I'm a Man, 1971, by Chicago. Again, this diversity in music exemplified the zeitgeist of alternative expression and identity formation taking place within the borough. In venues such as the PT, a select few partygoers would match the percussive crescendos of funk-based songs with movement that equally went beyond the bounds of standardized performance. They would rapidly shuffle their feet, shimmy their shoulders, or gesture with their hands to the rhythm of the music being played. Others might slide in one direction before smoothly hitting multiple upright spins and coming to a stop, or they might lean back on one hand to touch the floor before springing back upright. Often, these movements were adapted and refashioned from previous African American forms, such as the moves of James Brown or eccentric dancers from the jazz era. The more one put a unique twist on a popular step or came up with their own novel sequences, the more crowds would gather and cheer on their performances. Young people in the Bronx interchangeably referred to such irreverent dancing as freestyling, going off, and, most importantly, breaking. Like the spirit of funk itself, such individualized dancing exuded independence, defiance, and exuberance, with practitioners being encouraged to cultivate their own corporeal subjectivity, rather than regurgitate. As a result, dancers invested so heavily in their movements that they passionately guarded them from would-be imitators. In my little neighborhood, you would get beat up for copying a guy's moves. That's how serious that dancing was, explained Kool Herc, a close friend of Herc's who accompanied him to the Plaza Tunnel and other local venues. La Rock's emphasis on originality is shared by virtually every other early breaker, suggesting that the will to adorn identified by Hurston was elevated to communal policy among Bronxites involved in the dance. Indeed, breakers risked social ostracization, and even physical violence, for failing to come up with their own moves during this period. As scholar Jim Vernon has pointed out, this emphasis on individuality was enforced collectively by both practitioners and audiences who demanded a certain level of knowledge and appreciation for aesthetic precedents within the dance. The rationale against biting, copying, was also closely tied to the realization that these dance moves were an embodied expression of a practitioner's sense of self. For somebody to mimic another's moves without permission was deemed to be an attack on. Of course, over time, certain movements gained widespread appeal and then were reproduced and adorned by other dancers. In this way, they became incorporated into the broader repertoire that breaking was becoming known for. For instance, Phase 2 explained how one particular move took the Bronx by storm in the early 1970s, and is still being utilized by breakers until today. DJs like John Brown would shout out over a James Brown song, "It's turnout time at the PT, turnout time at the PT." That scene definitely set the stage for what became the b-boy. Plaza Tunnel was where this one cat named Walter introduced the drop, a move b-boys are still doing to. As the name implies, the drop, also referred to as a pin drop, was a way to transition to the floor. A dancer would place their foot behind the opposite knee and squat down until the ball of their connected foot touched the ground. In this cross-legged, crouched position, dancers would push up off their feet and spin into an upright position. In their seminal book Jazz Dance, Marshall and Gene Stearns labeled this move a knee drop and explained how African American dancers adopted it from Russian folk performers in the 1930s. Similarly, veteran jazz dancer Charles Honey Coles associated breaking in the 1980s with Cossack dancers of the early 20th century and wondered how, in the absence of vaudeville and the axe, just where the current breakdancers discovered all those steps. Although it is likely that the move was influenced by jazz-era dancers, what is important to note here is that the drop was reconjured by African American youth in the 1970s to go off and break at local parties. Before Kool Herc began throwing his own parties, he was going to venues such as the Plaza Tunnel and seeing young people recombine the drop with other unique movements to funk music, marking the contours of a new dance that would take on greater form and visibility. The pin drop was a particularly important component of the emerging breaking phenomenon as the unexpected nature of the move, with one foot concealed behind the other during the fall, and the rapid, rotating recovery of spinning back upright onto one's feet caught the attention of audiences, leading other dancers to quickly adapt it and embody their own identity through it. For instance, some would emphasize their physical acumen through the move by jumping high in the air before coming down to the floor, while others would execute multiple rotations when spinning back upright from the drop. Other breakers would accentuate the move with a comedic gesture or pop culture reference, such as pulling up their coat collar like Dracula when going down to the floor and pulling their coat back up when spinning upright onto their feet. Through such varying displays, the pin drop quickly became a sensation in the borough and was closely associated with the repertoire of movements signified by the. As such displays went beyond the bounds of audience expectations, young people also developed alternative modes of dance floor interaction. Namely, a tradition of spontaneously challenging and outdoing an opponent, which became known as burning in the Bronx. The competitive interaction identified by dance historian Jackie Malone as central to African American expression re-emerged with this youth-oriented movement, as teenagers would test each other's skills by putting a more creative twist on a popular step, acting out a humiliating insult, or dropping to the floor and coming back up with their hands directly in an opponent's face. These sequences displayed everything from wit and playfulness to aggression and intensity. It all depended on the situation, but the main aim remained exchanging creatively with a competitor on the dance floor. At around this same time, aerosol artists were adorning their nicknames on subway cars by putting outlines over their signatures and filling them in with greater color and design. Such elaborate murals were likewise called burners, and the act of outdoing another artist with them was known as burning. As can be seen, whether in terms of painting on trains or dancing in clubs, the attitude of leaving your mark creatively and making your presence felt was encapsulated in the shared terminology of young women were also heavily involved in this burning era of breaking. In fact, many practitioners suggest that it was often specifically the girls who would challenge the guys on the dance floor. Take, for example, this early account from Kool Rock, describing how Kool Herc and he became friends by going to clubs and dancing against girls. So girls during that time used to do what we call burning people up, as they used to call it. The girls are burning people up and Herc used to come find me and say, "Come on Coke, come and dance with her." Herc never seen a girl burn me, so that was another reason how we got so tight. I used to go to a lot of clubs, so Herc used to come get me to dance against the La Rock is referring here to a time before Herc and he began throwing their own parties, demonstrating how breaking and burning were underground practices among young people in the borough even before the advent of what came to be known as hip-hop. And girls were not merely passive onlookers or partners for guys during such displays. They were active, co-equal participants. As DJ Tyrone the mixologist from the Southeast Bronx attests, there was girls burning guys first, while early MC Kool Kyle from the North Bronx remembers going to parties where we'd grab a bunch of cute girls and we'd do these moves. We'd burn these girls. These are testimonies from different regions of the borough, given independent from one another, corroborating the fact that young women were widely engaged in the competitive acts of burning. Once again, this speaks to the alternative subjectivity being embodied by working-class African Americans during this period. Females figured prominently in the early development of breaking. For now, suffice it to say that the common assumption that breaking was exclusively created as an assertion of male dominance or masculinity is undermined by the testimony of hip-hop's founders. As the above discussion of breaking's beginnings illustrates, a new generation of African American youth came to the fore in the late 1960s and early 1970s, at the same time that the Bronx was undergoing rapid demographic change, to express themselves in assertive and dynamic ways. The weekend parties at the Plaza Tunnel epitomized these changes both culturally and socially. Here was a formerly prestigious establishment for white residents transformed into a nightclub for working-class African American teenagers, where a diverse repertoire of funk, soul, and rock records would be heard on a weekly basis. Innovative forms of expression, ranging from individualized dancing to microphone shoutouts, were also fostered within this underground atmosphere, helping set the stage for hip-hop culture. And just as the media would later mischaracterize breaking as an outgrowth of criminality, the congregation of young African Americans at the Plaza Tunnel was met with denunciations by residents and state authorities. In March 1973, the New York City Department of Consumer Affairs revoked the Plaza Tunnel's cabaret license after receiving complaints from neighbors that attendees were causing annoyance, abuse, and harassment in the area. It was alleged that partygoers had blocked the sidewalk, fought, made noise, and intimidated passers-by. As a result, the city sent inspectors and police to issue arrests for minor parking summons, public intoxication, and disorderly conduct. Meanwhile, the Plaza Tunnel staff insisted that they never had any problems on their premises, and that the charges were racially motivated. One club official even told the New York Times that, "The people who live around here, they're trying to turn the clock back, make the neighborhood the way it was 25 years ago. That's why they're complaining." Such suspicions were reaffirmed by the paranoia interviewees expressed in the same report. "There were a lot of colored people outside," said an elderly widow who passed by the nightclub. "They may have been all right, but you can never tell. I know that some of them looked drunk. I got away as fast as I could." Even a decade later, the Concourse Plaza Hotel's owner Joseph Caspi maintained that racism was to blame for the club's demise. "My personal opinion is that the local politicians were able to bring enough pressure to stop the blacks being in the hotel," Caspi explained, adding that they were hoping they might retard change in the neighborhood. Legal appeals were issued to overturn the city's revocation, but to no avail. The state Supreme Court justice who ultimately upheld the decision was himself a resident of the Grand Concourse and refused to recuse himself. By the summer of 1973, after only 2 years of operation, the doors of the plaza. Although the controversy surrounding this case was well documented at the time, hip-hop scholars have, unfortunately, blamed the club's demise on African Americans themselves. Specifically, they have claimed that members of the Black Spades gang would intimidate the crowd at the Plaza Tunnel and overrun the floor when the DJ would play Soul Power, 1971, by James Brown. Herc himself has also attributed the closure of some of the Bronx clubs to gang intimidation, but, to my knowledge, he never specifically mentions the Plaza Tunnel. Nor is there any mention of gang activity in any of the public records related to the club's license being revoked. In fact, a prominent member of the Black Spades recently explained that it would have been too risky for them to engage in anything aside from partying at a venue as prominent as the Plaza Tunnel, which, at the time, was located across the street from the Bronx County Courthouse. "We would dance, that's about it," he maintained. "There was no fighting or nothing in there." Taking all of this into account, it is difficult to determine what, if any, role gangs played in the. It seems more likely that the city's closure of the Plaza Tunnel was prompted by older, mostly white residents who lived in the Grand Concourse area. Conceptions of cultural difference played a critical role in the anxiety and opposition expressed by these residents, as the stability of this changing neighborhood was deemed to be under attack by the nighttime congregation of African American teenagers. This anxiety also corresponded to a broader national discourse from this period that painted working-class African Americans as socially pathological. Despite there being no legal records showing any serious disturbances at the Plaza Tunnel, only minor complaints about patrons blocking sidewalks and being public nuisances, city officials assumed that young African Americans were involved in antisocial behavior. Under this pretense, they swiftly closed the club using flimsy technical violations, such as the Plaza Tunnel's manager's failure to keep a roster of employees on call at all times, as a just. Sadly, this presumption of criminality in historical scholarship on hip-hop has extended to depictions of breaking itself, with most commentators attributing the emergence of the dance to gang activity. However, as the above analysis demonstrates, breaking was a product of the long-standing African American tradition of creating music and movement together in autonomous dance spaces. It did not have any direct connection to gangs. Even the competitive burning that took place within the dance was more akin to the challenge dances of hoofers, ballroom contests of swing dancers, and playing of the dozens seen throughout African American history. Although breaking sensibilities may have been deemed outlaw, in terms of existing outside the confines of mainstream society, the widespread claim that there was a causal connection between gangs and hip-hop is unsubstantiated by the testimony of the culture. In addition, although breaking was certainly informed by the broader climate of discrimination and cultural contestation taking place in the Bronx at the time, I would not attribute the dance's emergence to such an external opposition. Rather, breaking was overwhelmingly centered on the style, pleasure, and sense of self practitioners derived from their expressions internally. Young people dancing at clubs such as the Plaza Tunnel were not venting out in protest against injustice but, rather, expressing their own soul world and dank, like flame as Hughes predicted they would. The narrative that hip-hop pioneers lived in an environment that had become comparable to the one in Lord of the Flies where children stranded on an island with no adult guidance create a new, brutal social order of their own has been grossly over-exaggerated. Indeed, many early practitioners were not from destitute backgrounds but, rather, from working-class families who were persevering in the Bronx despite the obstacles being put before them. It was this sense of community and cultural tradition that was the basis for their kinesthetic. Of course, the racism and injustice taking place around them only increased the proclivity of African American youth to dance as they saw fit. Rather than look for mainstream acceptance, they congregated in clubs and house parties where they could be with like-minded peers and express themselves without concern. It should also be remembered that breaking emerged at a time when young people were increasingly gravitating towards self-affirming forms of cultural expression, and it is within this particular context that the African American juke continuum combined with the subjectivity of Bronx youth, leading to their distinct interpretation of funk-based music, individualized expression, local terminology, shared movement vocabulary, and heightened emphasis on assertive identity. In other words, breaking emerged as both an embodiment of a cultural past and a reinterpretation of it, just as it was shaped by socioeconomic conditions, and, at the same time, while the closure of the Plaza Tunnel deprived African American teenagers of an important venue for congregation, it by no means stopped their embodied creativity. Instead, such suppression gave way to more localized forms of congregation and movement expression, with the energy of the Plaza Tunnel transferred into smaller neighborhood centers, house parties, and church halls where teenagers continued to freestyle, burn, and go off. The visceral pleasure of moving together to music and cultivating a sense of identity remained motivating enough factors for them to resist external attempts to stifle these expressions. And by August 11, 1973 at 1520 Sedgwick Avenue, just a few months after the Plaza Tunnel had closed, Kool Herc's younger sister, Cindy, would provide a new forum where the cultural energy harnessed in these spaces would be propelled